Today's episode is brought to you by Positively Productive Systems, whose mission is to be the antidote to your stress and to provide compassionate productivity resources and coaching that help you heal and achieve. Be sure to check out both free and paid resources at positivelyproductive.com/resources.
Looking at nature for a mere 40 seconds drops your blood pressure, drops your heart rate, restores attention, and enables you to think more clearly and arguably more creatively than no view of nature at all.
You're listening to the Positively Living podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Zaratny, founder of Positively Productive Systems and a productivity coach certified in positive psychology and stress management. Join me as we explore ways to live a more proactive, positive life with episodes on productivity, self-awareness, mindset, entrepreneur life, habits and systems, simplicity, fun, and more. I understand overwhelm personally as a multi-passionate entrepreneur, wife and mom to kids and cats, and as a caregiver. I'm here to help you choose what's right for you so you can do less, live more, and breathe easier. Sound good? Let's get to it. Welcome to the Positively Living podcast. I'm your host, Lisa, and today we're exploring another tool for your productivity and positively living toolbox. Biophilic design. This may be one you already use, whether you realize it or not, or one you've considered, and I'll be curious to know what you think. Because I suffered through Latin in high school, I knew that this kind of design indicated a love of life, nature specifically. But my guest, Kasey Riley, helps us uncover what it actually means and why we need to preserve and promote that love of nature by bringing it inside. She and her husband own the Fat Plant Society, a company specializing in biophilic design, and today Kasey shares what they've learned, research that backs it up, and why their chosen plant to work with is moss. Kasey has a background in teaching that will be delightfully obvious as she regales us with the science and history behind this approach, including the many ways our society has been inclined to connect with nature and to take it with us, and the myriad of benefits that even a little bit of green can bring. We cover a lot of ground in this conversation, and I hope that what we've shared encourages you to include this practice in your life. One quick note, Kasey mentions 2 episodes, one on task switching and the other on note-taking, and I've included those links in the show notes. Now let's join Kasey to talk about nature and design. Welcome to the Positively Living podcast, Kasey Riley. When I say I am delighted to have you here, it's probably an understatement. I know that you have been a fan of the podcast for a while, and I love that you are now joining the ranks as a very special guest to talk about really intriguing topics. So welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Kasey, you are part of the new season, essentially, of Positively Living, where we're digging in even deeper and finding better and more interesting tools for our toolbox of living better, living more productively. But before we get into the topic of the day, please tell us a little bit about who you are and who you help. And of course, my favorite part of this question is always, what makes you light up?
My name is Kasey Riley. My husband, Morten Klinte, and I own the Fat Plant Society. We are a biophilic design studio located in Kansas City, Missouri, and we specialize in moss design for interiors. We are biophilic design consultants, and we utilize moss as our primary material because moss is so very, very, very sustainable. We founded the company in 2016. I'm happy to report that we've experienced quite a bit of growth since that time. And gosh, I guess this is our 8th, 9th year in operation. We couldn't love what we do more. Biophilic design, of course, is a design method that aims to improve productivity and enhance mental capacity through nature.
Have you always been a nature person? I guess a fan of sustainability or things like that? Or has that just sort of come around based on your experiences?
I know that my husband has always been a plant person and has always had an affinity. He's natural understanding, and his natural ability to understand the plant world and to know what plants need has and does continue to impress me. On my end, I was a kid of the 70s. It's very interesting. When I was prepping my notes for our conversation, again, I was reminded there was a real resurgence of biophilic design and the foundations for biophilic design, which date back centuries, but it really experienced quite a resurgence in the 1970s by virtue of a couple of different people, psychoanalyst Eric Fromm, and then concurrently Edward O. Wilson, who coined the term the biophilia hypothesis. The other thing that was really integral in my education growing up was spending time in nature. At that point in time, I was in Iowa. At a public elementary school, we were afforded the luxury of going out into the woods and being given a scavenger hunt sheet. And we were given a sheet, and we would have to go find all the list of things on the scavenger in a park, in a very wooded, very rich, very lush park. So you could find everything from wildflowers to specific types of plants. And I realize now that having that as a part of my education was really quite a luxury.
It inspired us in a different way. And now you've got me thinking. I'm going to give a shout out to my 5th grade teacher, Mr. Burton. And he was one of my all-time favorites. And one of the reasons I think he was my favorite is because he got us out into nature so much. And do not get me wrong, I am definitely a glamping kind of gal. I used to say that roughing it would be no cable, okay? Or I can't get a Wi-Fi signal. However, I did grow up in a rural area. I still live in a rural area, and I can appreciate a lot about nature. There are so many elements of it that I know are so important for us. And we hear about things like even, like forest bathing, right? In the Japanese culture and things like that. There's so many ways in which nature is so good for us. So we did have this inspiration, and I love that you pulled from that and that your husband also brought this love to you as well. So you mentioned how far biophilic design goes back. Would you help us set this foundation here for this concept? And please do the definition again. Was it, in fact, intended specifically to help us live better and more productively?
It dates back so far. I feel I can say without a doubt that it was absolutely intended for human well-being always and forever. And I think that's interesting because, when we think about moving from the settings of what would have been primitive society into more civilized society, one of the things that we decided collectively as humanity to bring with us was this notion of biophilic design and of the importance of nature. Think back to the Zen gardens of Japan, which would date to, oh my gosh, the medieval times. Found out the other day in doing a little bit of a deeper dive that the first botanical garden was actually created in 1545 in Padua, Italy. But we can go back even further and look to the Hanging Gardens of Babylon.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I know. That's a big one. That's a big one to toss out there. But the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which were built between 605 and 562 BC. I love that human beings have this affinity for nature. We always have. And so even as we move from our primitive settings that might have had us completely immersed in nature all the time to what we would consider civilization, from the moment we did so, we tended to bring nature with us. So I'm kind of fast forwarding from Padua, Italy, and the creation of the first botanical garden in 1545, and then fast forward to the botanical societies in Europe and the US. There is a period of time, though, and this is where it gets interesting, from these foundations, which take place in, medieval times all the way through to the early 1900s. There is then, and I guess I'm going to point my finger at the Industrial Revolution.
I had a feeling you might, yeah.
There is a time where it wanes. I point my finger at that particular pretty important historical milestone. And then fortunately in the 70s, we see another resurgence. And we see that resurgence take place. I know I saw it take place in my childhood experiences in elementary school in Iowa. I know that Edward O. Wilson was writing about biophilia and developing the biophilia hypothesis at that time. From the psychoanalyst is developing his notion of biophilia and the love for life. And as a psychoanalyst, basically what he's arguing is that we're innately preconditioned and predisposed to love life and to love other forms of life. So as much as we might love our own lives and our own existence, we are preternaturally inclined to love all forms of life.
It's so intriguing, too, because so often, especially from a psychoanalyst perspective, we talk about looking inward, right, to ourselves. And in this case, it's almost flipping the script of saying this is how we look outward, but in a really beautiful way. And maybe it's an empathetic way. I don't know. There's a lot of theories, I suppose, that could be thrust upon this, but it's this idea of appreciating other forms of life and how does that benefit our lives? And that's what we're exploring in a conversation in 2024. So it's fascinating.
I would venture to say that I know it's true for me. I bet it's true for you. I'm sure it's true for a lot of our listeners. Remember those moments of being a kid out in nature and having something that you were trying to save? Whether it was a squirrel or a bird or a butterfly. To me, that sort of childhood inclination to commune with life and even rescue life is what cements that notion of its innateness. I love to think that we all have this kindness in us and we all feel happier and better in nature. In the modern world, when we look to where people take vacation or get away or try to take a break, their goal is often to get as far off grid and as far away from the noise and the bustle of modern society as they can. And I think that's why we like beaches and forests. And you mentioned Shinrin-yoku and the notion of forest bathing. We just keep returning to it again and again.
Yeah, and the studies are backing it up. And I've even mentioned this in the podcast before of this idea where when you are feeling stuck and you need a break and you're trying to be creative, to step away and very specifically go for a walk and in nature, if you are able to do so, actually makes a difference and not just, anecdotally. This is like based on studies now. It's really fascinating. So here we have this appreciation, this curiosity being drawn to this. And you can see it throughout history, as you've mentioned, in different ways in botanical gardens and things. Then, of course, the inclination to go toward it when we need a break, when we need a breather. I do think there's some really interesting connections here with the Industrial Revolution, with how much we got locked into this like go, 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 push, push, push. It's the hustle culture that I talk about all the time and saying, hey, there's a better way. I wonder, too, if the 60s, and the whole like flower child is, a representation of that. It was a backlash against the structure and the constraint. And therefore, nature is a great example of right the opposite of that, where if you have a building and you leave it to nature, what happens? Things grow over it and nature kind of takes it back. So here we are with this inclination, and you said that it's been studied, so let's get into that. We know inherently that we feel better. This is why we're drawn to it. This is why the vacations are like this. But what did Eric Fromm and Edward O. Wilson and others, what did we find? What are the connections here to the true benefits of us being in nature, bringing ourselves back to nature?
Our minds need it. And I think our bodies too. I mean, the mind-body connection being so incredibly important. The first thing that I'll go to is the fact that study after study, and this is a Journal of Psychology article from 2015 that I'm citing, looking at nature for a mere 40 seconds drops your blood pressure, drops your heart rate, restores attention, and enables you to think more clearly and arguably more creatively than no view of nature at all. Kaplan and Kaplan, who were a pair of psychologists writing in the 80s, and their first book is published in 1985, they addressed the notion of attention restoration. I always chuckle because in 1989, the demands on our attention were far fewer. And that attention restoration becomes so important because I think it was, again, a recent episode of yours in which you mentioned how many times a given individual picks up a cell phone in a day, in one single day. I mean, that alone, that interruption of thought. So Kaplan and Kaplan really address the importance of nature in terms of attention restoration, in that looking up and out. And here's some of the things we know and we don't know. And one of the things I love the most about academic studies is they are so specific in what they're addressing. Certain academic studies might be addressing attention restoration. Others might be addressing creativity. More recently, they're even addressing memory and dementia. The bottom line is that we know that nature is thus far the most effective thing we can do, or the most valuable thing we can see to help us improve attention, restore that attention deficit. Another author by the name of Richard Louv, Louv, he wrote about the nature deficit in 2005, which is around the same exact time that Stephen Kellert starts writing about biophilia. They address the fact that it takes such a short exposure. And so that then begins to beg the question, what type of nature is best? And I think just like anything, we can look at, obviously, the best situation would be forest bathing, as you mentioned earlier. And we know that 20 minutes of forest bathing, and I'm so fortunate. Here in Kansas City, I live within walking distance to at least 5 different public parks. I know from my own experience that looking at nature and spending time in nature, whether it's visual, meaning artificial, whether it's 20 minutes for a walk in the forest, or whether it's incorporating nature inside, really does play a very, very, very significant role in grounding, centering, attention restoration, lowering anxiety, lowering blood pressure, lowering cortisol, reducing stress as a whole.
Yeah, so I was just about to start collecting these benefits that have been sprinkled in. So attention restoration, creativity, memory, reducing anger and anxiety. And I wrote down reducing stress, the stress response, I should say, the distress response, grounding, centering. And again, it's interesting because we list all these things, but they all overlap so distinctly. I talk with my family. Again, I've said this so many times, that I live in a sea of ADHD. And I know my husband is a great example of this, and he will say it flat out that being able to step outside and be in nature, even for a few minutes, doing something randomly, walking, along our property. And we are lucky to have many acres of, including wooded property. It changes his brain for the good. And it changes, his entire response to everything. So I can absolutely see it working. With that in mind, as we seek to find ways to incorporate nature in design like you do, in our daily habits, what do we do when we're in New York like we are and we can look out the window? This sounds promising. You said 40 seconds. I think I could do 40 seconds looking out the window in the winter. I'm also thinking about the traditions with, celebrating Christmas, or what the precursor to Christmas, the solstice, and bringing evergreens into the home, and right, the trees and the garland and things like that. I'm making those connections. So that might be an example. What are other examples of things we can do from simple to complex that can help us make this connection?
I have a word for what you're describing, or it's a phrase.
Okay.
And it's not my phrase. It's called soft fascination.
Ooh.
And Kaplan address that soft fascination in their research. And I love that they do that because it's really important. Our brains really love that. I think it's the soft fascination that we experience through actual greenery. That obviously big fan of the ocean. Oceans are beautiful. I could, if I were sitting in front of sitting on a beach right now, I would honestly sit there all day and never move and wait till the sun sets until it got too cold that I had to go inside. But that soft fascination really comes through greenery and, leafy greens. And that's why we all love it when the trees start to bud. And this time of year when the smell in the air starts to change. I mean, I can almost feel my body waking up and going, oh, hey, I'm not miserable or I'm less miserable. I struggle with winter and it's a tough time. I'm very fortunate that I have a lot of moss in my house. And so back to that notion of attention restoration and soft fascination, the things we can do, and the thing that biophilic design, I think, really brings to the conversation is a reminder of our innate love for greenery, a reminder of how innate our connection to it is, and how much it restores us and how much we love it. And moss is such an interesting plant in and of itself in that it is a rootless plant. So to sort of hop over to how on earth that works, how on earth is the Fat Plant Society and other companies, how are any of us in the biophilic design world able to bring moss, this wonderful plant from the forest indoors? And my gosh, the terms for moss and how it's utilized as a modern design material are many. It's referred to as preserved. It's referred to as zombie moss. It's referred to as static moss. At the Fat Plant Society, we use the term dormant, and we use that term for a reason. Knowing plants as well as we do, we would argue humbly that is the most accurate word to use. Moss is a rootless plant. That's why it can grow on stones and cars, and it is in and of itself rootless. Moss in nature will go into dormancy when it does not have enough resources to survive. It is one of the sturdiest life forms writ large. It can go up to 100 years or more in dormancy. The wonderful thing about it is that when the resources are returned, and generally that primary resource is moisture, moss springs back into life. So the moss that we use at the Fat Plant Society has been rendered dormant. It's harvested in North Carolina and Kentucky, and we're a little particular, and we made a decision some years ago, and we're sticking to it, even though it does have an effect on the bottom line. But you want to walk the talk, and you want to mean what you say and say what you mean, and we feel that very strongly. So we don't import from overseas. We have a wonderful moss provider here in the U.S., and we know that he takes great care to make sure that he doesn't overharvest any particular area. He waits a minimum of 2 years for regrowth. That matters. You would hate to see any natural resource become abused. The moss that we use has been essentially forced into dormancy using a paraffin and glycerin process, and then it's enhanced with a vegetal dye. In the wild, what we call reindeer moss is actually a little bit lighter in color. It's more of a mint green or even a beige color. So the reindeer moss that we use is this wonderful spring green. And it's been essentially coated with a paraffin and glycerin that forces it into dormancy. The reason that I'm so married to the term dormant is because I know from my own experience that if I take a piece of moss and I put it outside and I give it its ideal growing environment, which means lots of moisture and lots of shade, that it will start to grow again. It's the experiments that we've conducted sort of on the ground that enable me to feel that confident about it. It's such a miraculous plant. And as it turns out, as miraculous as it is in the wild, it is equally durable, wonderful, and frankly sustainable in interiors. So once it's brought into the interior setting, it does not need watering. It does not need misting. It does not require a dirt substrate. Because if we used any of those things, we would essentially move it out of dormancy, and we don't want to do that. We want to let it hang and let us provide us with the benefits that nature provides. But in an interior setting, And then, it saves us a great deal in water. And that is not to say that we don't love plants. We love plants. However, for those who might not have the budget or the manpower, person power to ensure that plants are always looking at their best, this is a means by which to introduce real greenery into a setting and leave it be with virtually no maintenance or expense.
I'm hearing high sustainability and really low maintenance, which I like the idea of. And also hearing another option other than, hey, lots of houseplants, which sometimes when you have, let's say, kids or pets, that might not be an option. So the idea that it's dormant also says to me that there's a respect for the life form and that you're able to hold on to it for safekeeping and appreciation. So it also suggests to me that it is not certain elements of plants, which I know are fantastic for us. I know what plants do for us in terms of clearing the air for us, right? And those experiences. So in this case, if it's in fact dormant, then would I understand correctly that what it's doing for us is actually more of a visual cue?
It is definitely a visual cue, but the wonderful thing about moss is that it is incredibly dense and very porous. So even dormant moss is going to absorb volatile organic compounds in the air.
Wow. Okay.
And it does. It interestingly absorbs odors without retaining them. And I'll give you an example. I am a meat eater in the Midwest, and Sunday morning bacon is my once a week treat. But we all know that smell that bacon leaves in your home and that it's pretty pervasive. In my house, because of the amount of moss I have here, the smell of the bacon dissipates in half, probably quarter of the time, but the moss doesn't retain the scent. It's just this wonderfully porous material. So it's absorbing volatile organic compounds and odors, but it also dampens noise. And again, when I mentioned earlier that we have all these knowns, but we also have a lot of unknowns. One of the unknowns I think we have at this point is how much biophilia does it take to enable us to feel better, to fully dampen noise, to possibly reduce the effects of dementia? How much do we need to actually see measurable and demonstrable diminishes or slowing of dementia? How much attention restoration? There's a degree of studies, but I love that there's more work to be done because those are the exciting possibilities and prospects.
Right. So with this idea of this exploration into the future, let's bring it back to the now and what we can do. And even like the smallest amounts, I almost want to go to the smallest common denominator. And moss, I mean, you certainly have me convinced at this point. I find this so intriguing because it's not a place that I would have gone before. We normally think, oh, we're bringing the green inside. You know, it's either a design element or we're bringing in houseplants. And to your point, it's not like this either or. It's this mix of things depending upon how you live, what you're able to have in your space. Could also have to do with allergies too. That might be a consideration. Is that, by the way, a consideration? Or are there any situations where moss might not be a good option?
No, in terms of the allergens, because of the paraffin glycerin process, it is hypoallergenic, which is wonderful.
Is there not a situation or an environment in which you might have the moss and it would perhaps be humid enough where it would bring it out of dormancy? Or would that have to be significant?
I've actually seen it happen. I've seen it happen here in Kansas City when we are at the heat of summer. Our humidity levels and our dew point levels get very, very high. And I have seen, there are a couple of installations that I've seen sort of change. That happens particularly with pillow moss. We work with sheet moss, shag moss, reindeer moss, and pillow moss. Our Instagram page sort of breaks down the differences between them. But I do remember seeing in the heat of summer, seeing an installation start to change. Despite the paraffin and glycerin that has forced it into dormancy, to quote Jurassic Park and Jeff Goldblum, life finds a way. On the flip side, when the humidity gets below 35%, the moss, like we all do, kind of dry out. We can feel it in our hair. We can feel it in our skin. We can feel it. So when the humidity level drops below 35%, the moss can become a little brittle to the touch. And what happens is that small pieces break off and become sort of moss lint. And it sort of feels like it's dead. It's not, because again, this wonderfully resilient plant that, can lay dormant for as long as 100 years, he's merely responding to its ambient environment. And most of us within the biophilic design industry and anyone working with moss, we give it a confident 7 to 10 years. It's still so new that I don't have a piece in my home that is yet 10 years old. I soon will, but we can with great confidence give it 7 to 10 years and say that, yeah, there are a few things to keep in mind, but those things are very human. Humans like things above 35% humidity too.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm immediately thinking about my dry skin right now. Okay, so this sounds really incredible. And I'm absolutely sold. But realistically, for those of us who are not going to get a moss wall at this point, what are some of our options? And I know, like, I'm looking at you on video right now and seeing behind you a really cool, it's essentially like moss artwork, a circular piece of moss that looks like about the size of a mirror that you might have up on your wall. So what are some of our options? And again, this also goes with other design elements, other types of plant options, but what are some of the things you would suggest that something we could literally go do today even?
We offer a handful of standard products on our website, and we also offer, and we're happy to do it, and we love to do it. We consult with residential clients to the same degree that we consult with architects and interior designers. To us, it doesn't make a difference. Our clients are our clients, and it sounds corny, but we really do care so much about what we do. It's an investment, just like a piece of art or any other, accoutrement to the home. You make an investment. At least 80% of our work is custom. Working with a client to create a piece that is specifically designed for their needs in their home, for that space, that's a wonderful thing to be able to do. Now, that said, we created the skinny panel and we created the small suite of standard products with the aim of making sure that it's accessible to everybody. I would say that the ROI on that investment is pretty significant in terms of well-being, and whether it's, an employer who is wanting to invest for retention and employee satisfaction and placemaking, or whether it's someone who works at home who is trying to enhance their home office space. We love to see greenery implemented in any way possible because, again, back to the science, we know that it's good for our brains. And I would just say anytime any of us can turn to nature to sort of soothe the challenges of modern life, the better off we all are.
Yeah. So it sounds to me like there's a combination of things we can do. One is literally turning to nature however we can, whether if we have an office window that we can look out of periodically, maybe adjusting our space to look for that, make it easier to look out of. Again, watch your feng shui, but still, that's one thing. Any way that we can bring in more greenery, plant life, basically being open to the green sounds like a good way for us to go. And with that in mind, I think that's a great place for us to wrap up. And I will definitely have your links in the show notes. So if one of these panels is of interest, you can go check that out. You can check out what the Fat Plant Society is all about and keep in touch with Kasey and learn more. And with that, Kasey, are you ready for the rapid wrap up?
Oh, I'm ready.
This rapid wrap up is going to be 3 things that inspire positively living for you. So it'll be a song, a saying, and a resource. Could be a book or an app or anything. So what are a song, a saying, and a resource for you that inspires positively living?
This song is Dancing in the Moonlight, the original version from the 1970s. by King Harvest. I want to say 1974, but please don't quote me on that. There was a remake, but I'm really partial to the original. The quote, I gave this a lot of thought, but it's one that I used to use. I was a teaching professor before I found myself here in this wonderful situation as co-owner of the Fat Plant Society. And it was the quote that I used to write on the board on the first day of class. And it's Robert Frost. Education is the ability to listen to almost anything without losing your temper or your self-esteem.
Ooh, that's good. And how about a resource?
I wanted to say my husband. He is a wonderful resource and he helps me through a lot, but note-taking. I really loved your episode recently on note-taking. Because of that episode, I found myself going through my notebooks, which date back no more than about 8 years. I really enjoyed, and I was actually really stimulated and energized by going through my old notebooks and reading. Thought to myself, hey, I had some good, have some good ideas every once in a while. I can't say enough about note-taking. And again, however one happens to choose to do it, I think it's a really wonderful thing to do. I think it's how we keep track of ourselves and what's going on in our heads in this modern world.
I would agree. That's why I had an episode on it with Emily Aborn. So thank you for mentioning that. And yeah, this idea of not only taking the notes, but reviewing the notes and processing that. There's so much benefit. Okay. And last bonus question, which is definitely not least, is what are you grateful for today, Kasey?
I am really, really, really grateful for the opportunity to just sit here and look at the plants and greenery around me and the knowledge that the plants and greenery just outside my back door are also starting to come back to life. It is a buoyancy of the soul, so to speak, that spring, I hope, brings us all. Watching the life forms kind of come back, I think is a wonderful reminder of how resilient not only plant life is, but all life is.
Oh, what a beautiful way to end. Buoyancy of the soul. You've certainly brought that to us today, Kasey. So I am so grateful for you and grateful for you shining your light so bright in this world and for sharing it with us today.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you for joining me today. Your time is precious and limited, and I'm honored you chose to spend it with me. If you have feedback, questions, or want to schedule a chat, head to positivelyproductive.com/connect. And if you are looking for any of the resources referenced on the podcast, from books to products to training and more, go to positivelyproductive.com/resources.